The day Annie Graves buried her last hope alongside her husband was the same day she decided she would never let anyone find her again. The wind came off the Nevada desert in waves that September of 1878, hot and gritty and indifferent to the small mound of earth she had packed down with her own bare hands behind the little homestead outside of Calico Flats. She had said the words she knew, the 23rd Psalm, the Lord's Prayer, a few lines from a hymn she half remembered from a church in Ohio she had not seen in 11 years. Then she had gone inside and sat at the table in the dark until the candle burned down to nothing, and she had not cried, which frightened her more than anything else about that day. Her husband, Robert Graves, had not been a cruel man. That was what she told herself when the weight of his absence tried to become something other than grief. He had been quiet in the way that certain men are quiet, not peaceful, not contemplative, but absent from the inside outward, hollowed by gambling debts and bad luck, and a particular brand of stubbornness that had brought them from Cincinnati to a dusty stretch of Nevada scrubland on a promise that had never materialized. He had worked the silver claim for 3 years without pulling enough ore to pay back what he owed, and when the fever came in August, it had moved fast and showed no mercy. And by the first week of September, Annie Graves was alone with a small house, $47 in a tin can buried under the floorboards, 2 horses, a milk cow, a kitchen garden, and the absolute and settled conviction that the life she had imagined for herself was finished. She was 28 years old. The nearest town of any real size was Calico Flats, 8 miles east across a flat stretch of alkali that turned pink at sunrise and white as bone by noon. Annie went to town once a week for supplies and occasionally to sell eggs or butter at the dry goods store run by a wide woman named Hester Beaumont, who kept accounts with a pencil stub and a suspicious squint. Hester was the closest thing Annie had to a friend in the territory, which said something about the nature of Annie's life that she chose not to examine too closely. It was Hester who told her about the letter. It was a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks after Robert's burial, and the air had begun to carry the first edge of autumn coolness that passed for winter in the desert lowlands. Annie had come in with a basket of eggs and a jar of cream, and was arranging them on the counter when Hester reached beneath the counter and produced an envelope with Annie's name written on it in a handwriting she did not recognize. "Came with the stage last Thursday," Hester said. "Return address is somewhere in Texas, a place called Harlan County." Annie looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. "I don't know anyone in Texas." "Well," Hester said, with the philosophical tone of a woman who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, "apparently someone in Texas knows you." Annie took the envelope home and set it on the table and looked at it for the better part of an evening before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and the letter was brief but so unexpected in its contents that she read it 3 times before she set it down. The letter was from a woman named Clara Whitmore, who identified herself as the sister of Robert Graves. Annie had not known Robert had a sister. She had not known much about Robert's family at all. He had spoken of them rarely and always in the past tense, as though they belonged to a country he had emigrated from and did not intend to return to. Clara Whitmore wrote that she had recently learned of her brother's death through a letter that had made its way through 3 different mail routes over 6 weeks, and she was writing to express her condolences and to ask a question. The question was this: did Annie intend to stay on the claim alone? Clara Whitmore wrote that she had a neighbor in Harlan County, a man of good character and reliable reputation, who had expressed interest in making an arrangement with a widow woman who had working land and might consider partnership of a practical and eventually, if the circumstances suited both parties, matrimonial nature. She wrote carefully and with obvious embarrassment, acknowledging that the proposal was irregular and that Annie was under no obligation whatsoever. She said the man's name was Timothy Watkins, that he was 32 years old, that he had his own horses and his own tools and a working knowledge of land and silver and cattle, and that he had asked Clara to write the letter because he was, in her words, entirely too stubborn to admit he needed anything but entirely too honest to pretend he didn't. Annie read that last line again. Entirely too stubborn to admit he needed anything, but entirely too honest to pretend he didn't. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the tin can under the floorboards next to the $47. Then she went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about what it meant that a complete stranger in Texas had heard her name and thought, yes, that is the direction I should move in. She wrote back to Clara Whitmore 3 days later. She said she appreciated the letter and the condolences and the frankness of the proposal. She said she was not interested. She said she had gotten herself to Nevada on the basis of someone else's idea of what her life ought to look like, and she was not prepared to do that again. She said she hoped Clara's neighbor, Mr. Watkins, found what he was looking for, but that she did not think she was the right answer to that particular question. She sealed the letter and carried it to Hester Beaumont's store and paid the postage and walked home across the pink alkali flat and told herself she felt better. She did not feel better. The winter came in the way Nevada winters did, not with the dramatic severity of the Ohio winters she remembered, not with blizzards and buried fences and weeks of white silence, but with a grinding gray dryness and cold winds that crept under the door and made the small house feel like a box someone had left in a cave. Annie worked. She tended the animals and kept the kitchen garden from dying completely and made repairs to the house's sagging south wall and read every book she had by the light of the kerosene lamp, until she could quote them without looking. She had 3 books, a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare's histories that she had been given in Ohio and had never quite finished, and a water-stained novel about a woman in England who married a man with a secret that she had read so many times the binding was soft as cloth. She was reading the novel for the 11th time on a cold night in December when she heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not gunfire or screaming or any of the sounds the desert sometimes produced in the dark. It was simply the sound of a horse, moving slowly along the track that led from the road to her house, and then stopping. Annie set the book down and took the rifle from above the door and stood to the side of the window and looked out. There was a man on a horse in her yard. He sat very still in the way that men who are comfortable on horseback sit, not tense, not relaxed exactly, but balanced and patient in a way that suggested he had spent a significant portion of his life in exactly that position. The horse was a large roan, well-kept, carrying saddlebags that looked full. The man was wearing a long canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and she could not see his face in the dark. "Hello, the house," he called. His voice was not loud, but it carried easily, a voice accustomed to outdoor spaces. Annie kept the rifle level. "Who's asking?" "My name is Timothy Watkins," the man said. "I rode up from Texas. I'm looking for a woman named Annie Graves." The silence that followed that statement was long enough that the horse shifted its weight and blew a quiet breath that steamed in the cold air. "You found her," Annie said, and even as she said it she was aware that something in her chest was doing something it had not done in a very long time, something that felt uncomfortably like the opposite of resignation. She opened the door. He was taller than she had imagined, which was strange because she had not known she had imagined him at all. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had done physical work since adolescence, and when he took off his hat she could see his face clearly in the lamplight, a face that was weathered but not old, with dark eyes and an honest jaw and the look of a man who had been told no a number of times and had found a way to keep going anyway. "I got your letter," he said. "The one you sent Clara, saying you weren't interested." "Then you know you've ridden a considerable distance for no reason," Annie said. She had not lowered the rifle entirely, though she had angled it toward the floor, which was a concession she noted without understanding it. "I know what the letter said," Timothy Watkins told her, "and I want you to know I'm not here to argue with it or ignore it or be the kind of man who thinks a woman saying no means she just needs more persuading. I'm not that kind of man." He paused and turned his hat in his hands. "But I did ride a considerable distance, and it is late and cold, and I was wondering if you might let me water my horse and maybe take supper somewhere that isn't outdoors before I turn around and head back." Annie looked at him for a long moment. "You rode from Texas," she said. "Yes, ma'am. In December. It took me about 3 weeks. The weather was mostly cooperative until the last 4 days." She considered this. She considered the horse, who was clearly tired and cold. She considered the man, who was clearly both of those things as well but was standing in her yard with a patience that suggested he had decided long ago that certain things were worth waiting for. "Put your horse in the barn," she said. "I'll heat supper." His name was the only thing she had known about him, and the reality of Timothy Watkins filled in around it in the way that real things always expand to overwhelm the sketches we draw of them. Over supper, a stew she had made 2 days before from dried beans and a bit of salt pork, which she was aware was not impressive but which he ate with the genuine appreciation of a man who had been eating trail food for 3 weeks. She learned the following things. He had grown up in Tennessee and had come west at 21 after his father died, and left the family farm to his elder brother, by an arrangement that Timothy had found reasonable at the time and still found reasonable, though he had never stopped thinking he might have preferred a different arrangement. He had worked cattle drives for 4 years, which had taken him through Texas and Kansas and once into Colorado, and then 3 years ago he had settled in Harlan County on a piece of land that needed clearing and had spent those 3 years clearing it and running a small cattle operation and making it, in his words, into something that looked like a future. He said this last thing carefully, as though he was aware of how it might sound. "And the future needs a woman in it," Annie said. She did not say it unkindly, but she said it directly, and she watched his face to see how he would handle directness. He handled it well. He met her eyes and did not look away and did not pretend the observation was unfair. "I think the future would be better with a partner in it," he said. "I think a lot of things are better that way, but I didn't come here to make a business proposal. Clara's letter made it sound like that's what this was, and maybe that's partly my fault for explaining it poorly to her, but it's not exactly right." "Then what is it exactly?" Annie asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands around the tin cup of coffee she had poured him. He had good hands, large and calloused, but careful in the way they held things. "Clara told me about you," he said. "She told me Robert had written her once a few years back describing you, and she told me after he died that you were out here alone, and I thought about that. I thought about it for a few weeks." He looked up. "I don't exactly know how to explain what made me decide to write the letter, other than to say that something about the idea of you being out here alone, having done what you'd done, having come all this way and worked this hard and then been left alone with it, it sat wrong with me. I don't mean that in a way that assumes you need saving. I mean it in the way that when something sits wrong with you long enough, you stop ignoring it." Annie was quiet. The wind moved outside and the lamp flame shifted in its glass. "I wrote back saying I wasn't interested," she said. "You did. And here you are." "Here I am," Timothy Watkins said, and there was something in the simple honesty of those 3 words that did something Annie could not quite name to the wall she had been building around herself since September. She told him he could sleep in the barn. He thanked her and went without argument, and she bolted the door and sat at the table in the lamplight and pressed her palms flat against the wood grain and breathed slowly and told herself, in very clear internal language, that she was not going to be foolish about this. She was, however, going to be awake for quite some time. He was still there in the morning. This fact surprised her even though it should not have, because he had nowhere to go before breakfast and the road back to town did not improve with early departure. She found him in the barn when she went to feed the animals, already awake and doing her morning chores with the focused efficiency of a man who saw work and responded to it automatically. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and kept doing it. She made breakfast, cornbread and the last of the bacon she had been rationing and more coffee, and he sat across from her at the table, and they talked in the way that two strangers talk when they are both intelligent people who have been alone too long and are surprised to find themselves interested. She learned that he had a scar along his left forearm from a wire fence incident during his cattle drive years that had required 14 stitches from a doctor in Abilene who had apparently considered himself a comedian. She learned that he had an opinion about Shakespeare's histories, a strong opinion, one that involved admiring the structure of Henry V and finding the Richard plays almost unbearably sad. And when she told him she had that very volume on her shelf, he looked at it with the expression of a person encountering an old friend. She learned that he had not been married before, which surprised her. He explained this briefly and without self-pity. He had spent his 20s moving constantly, which was not the kind of life that built relationships, and by the time he had the land and the stability he had found that the women who might have been interested had found their way to other men during those years of his absence, which he considered entirely fair and not anyone's fault. "And then Clara mentioned you," Annie said. "And then Clara mentioned you," he confirmed. I still wrote back saying no. "You did," he said, "but I had already been thinking about you for a while by then, and I thought she doesn't have to want to be found. I can just go see if the finding was the right idea or not. If it wasn't, I'll know that and I'll come home." Annie turned her coffee cup in her hands. "And is it?" she asked. "The right idea?" He looked at her across the table, and the morning light came through the small east window and lay across the scarred wood between them, and he said, "I think it might be, but I think you're the one who gets to decide that, and I think you should take whatever time you need." He stayed 3 days. She did not ask him to stay that long, and she did not ask him to leave, and he did not behave as though he had any expectations about the outcome of those 3 days. He helped with the work, efficiently and without being asked, and without making her feel as though she was being managed or surveyed. He fixed the south wall of the house, which had been bothering her since October, using materials he found in the barn, and an ingenuity with limited resources that she recognized as the mark of someone who had spent a long time making do. On the second evening he asked her about Robert. Not in a probing way, not in the way people ask about the dead when they want information, but with a directness that suggested he wanted to understand the shape of her life, the way you might ask someone to describe a piece of country you were going to travel through. She told him. She told him about Ohio and the marriage at 19, which had seemed like a good idea because Robert had been charming and confident, and had a plan, and 19-year-old Annie had been drawn to plans, the way certain people are drawn to maps, not because they want to follow them exactly, but because they find comfort in the existence of a route. She told him about the years of moving, from Ohio to Missouri to Kansas to Nevada, following Robert's certainty that the next place would be the place where everything worked. She told him about the silver claim and the 3 years of hard work and Robert's increasing silences, and the gambling losses she had not known about until they were already significant, and the fever and the burial and the autumn alone. She told him all of this in a level voice, not because she did not feel it, but because she had made a particular kind of peace with it. The kind of peace that is not happiness but is, at least, stability. The way a broken bone that has healed wrong is not the same as a bone that healed right but is still something you can walk on. Timothy listened in the way that very few people listen, which is to say completely, without preparing his next sentence while she was still finishing hers. When she was done, he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "Why are you thanking me?" "Because it cost you something," he said, "and you gave it anyway. That means something." On the third morning she found him at the barn before dawn, saddling the roan. He had his coat on and his saddlebags packed, and he was going through the checking process: girth, stirrups, the small methodical preparations of departure. And when he heard her, he turned and looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light. "You're leaving," she said. "I said I'd only stay a few days. I don't want to wear out a welcome that was already generous." She stood in the barn doorway with her arms crossed against the cold and watched him check the saddle girth again and thought about what she wanted to say, which was difficult because she was not entirely certain what she wanted to say. "I've gotten very used to managing alone," she told him finally. "I know," he said. "I've gotten used to it to the point where the idea of not being alone feels, I don't know how to explain it. It feels like a threat almost." He turned and looked at her, holding the reins loosely in one hand. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he said quietly. "Not your land, not your independence, not your way of doing things. I'm just a man who rode up from Texas because something told him this was the right direction to go." "That is," Annie said carefully, "a very impractical reason to ride 3 weeks in December." "I know," he said. "I've been called impractical before." She was quiet for a moment. The roan breathed steadily in the cold air. "Write to me," she said. He looked at her and she could see in his face the discipline it took for him not to let his relief show too obviously. "I'll write to you," he said, "and I'll write back, and we'll see. That's all I'm asking," he said. He rode out as the sun came up, turning once to look back at the house before the track bent around a low rise and took him out of sight. And Annie stood in the yard and watched him go, and then went back inside and stood at the table for a long moment before she sat down and realized, with some alarm, that she had been holding her breath since the barn. The letters began. His first arrived on the 23rd of December, having made the journey from Harlan County, Texas, to Calico Flats, Nevada, in 12 days, which was faster than she had expected. He wrote the way he talked, directly, without unnecessary ornamentation, but with a warmth underneath the plainness that came through on the page the same way it came through in person. He wrote about the land in Texas, describing it with enough specific detail that she could see it: the red clay soil, the live oak trees, the way the sky looked in Texas in winter, which he said was different from the sky in Nevada in a way he couldn't fully articulate but would try to if she gave him the opportunity. He wrote about his cattle, 12 head, a modest operation, nothing to boast about yet but something he was building with intention. He wrote about his neighbor, an old Mexican gentleman named Esteban Reyes, who had ranched that land for 30 years, and who had the habit of showing up at inconvenient times with good advice that Timothy was not always ready to hear. He wrote about the house he had built on his land, which was solid but spare in the way that a man alone builds things, and he said this without embarrassment, simply as a fact, that it was a house that had been designed with function and not comfort in mind, and he was aware of the difference. At the end of the letter he wrote, "I hope the winter is not too hard on you. I think about the homestead out there on the flat, and I think about the south wall, and I hope it's holding." Annie read this last line 3 times. She wrote back the same day she received the letter, sitting at the table with the kerosene lamp pulled close, and the wind coming under the door and the Shakespeare volume open at Henry V beside her for company, though she was not reading it. She wrote about the kitchen garden, which was mostly dormant but had produced a surprising late crop of turnips that she was still working her way through. She wrote about Hester Beaumont and the dry goods store and the social architecture of Calico Flats, which was a town of about 300 people, and the specific particular tensions that 300 people isolated in a desert community develop over time, the feuds and alliances and gossip networks, and the peculiar democracy of people who have to rely on each other regardless of whether they like each other. She wrote about the Shakespeare. She wrote about Henry V and the speech before Agincourt, which she had read so many times she knew it without trying to, and she wrote that she had always found that speech both stirring and a little heartbreaking, because it was a man telling other men that their shared suffering was going to make them brothers, and she had wondered sometimes whether it was true or whether it was what you said to people when the truth, which was that they were outnumbered and the odds were poor, would not serve the purpose. She sealed the letter and took it to Hester the next morning, and Hester looked at the address and looked at Annie and said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. His response to her thoughts on Henry V arrived 2 weeks later and took up 3 full pages. He agreed with her about the speech and disagreed with her about the nature of what it was. He thought it was not a lie, but a true thing said under conditions that required truth to be said differently than usual, which he thought happened more often than people admitted. He said that there were times in his life when he had needed someone to tell him that his difficulties were making him into something rather than simply taking things away from him. And he thought that was what the speech was doing, not denying the odds but reframing what enduring them meant. Annie sat with this letter by the window where the afternoon light came through cleanest and read it twice and thought, "This is a man who has thought about things." She had not expected that. She had not expected a great deal, she realized, and this absence of expectation was now being filled in ways that were simultaneously gratifying and unsettling. The way sunlight coming into a room that has been dark for a long time is both welcome and initially blinding. The letters continued through January and February, arriving with a regularity that spoke to a deliberate consistency on his part. He was writing every 2 weeks, she calculated, which meant he had made a decision about the frequency and was honoring it. She found herself writing back on the same schedule without having consciously decided to match it. The letters grew longer and ranged across more territory. They talked about music. She had played piano in Ohio and still remembered much of what she had known, though there was no piano within 40 miles. He had played no instruments but had a particular attachment to hymns he'd heard as a boy that he carried in his head, the way other people carry tunes from songs, not the words so much as the feeling of them. They talked about the question of justice, which was hard to avoid in the Nevada Territory in 1878, where the rights of the Paiute people whose land this had been were being eroded by the same westward expansion that had brought Annie there. Annie had thought about this more than most of the white settlers in the area cared to, and she wrote about it with the discomfort of someone who understood that her presence in this place was not an innocent fact, that the history she was part of was not a simple or clean story. She wrote that she did not know what to do with that knowledge other than to hold it honestly and not pretend it wasn't true. Timothy wrote back that he had thought about this too, that the land in Texas where he had settled had its own layered history of dispossession and violence that he could not be ignorant of even if many people around him preferred ignorance. He wrote about Esteban Reyes, who had told him things about the history of that land that were not taught in any school he had attended, and who had said once that the land itself remembered what had happened to it, whether the people who lived on it did or not. This letter made Annie put the pages down and look out the window at the Nevada flat, and think about the Paiute people who had walked these grounds for centuries before Robert Graves had planted a flag in the dirt and called it a silver claim. In March, she wrote him something she had not intended to write. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said when you were here, that you were just a man who rode in what felt like the right direction. I want you to know that I have spent most of my life distrusting that kind of instinct, my own and other people's. Robert was a man who trusted his instincts completely, and they were not always good instincts. But I am beginning to think that not all instincts are the same, that some people's sense of direction is better calibrated than others. And I am beginning to think, this is difficult for me to write, so I am going to write it anyway, that you may be one of those people." She sealed that letter before she could change her mind. His reply took 17 days, and she was aware of every single one of them passing. When it came, it was 4 pages, the longest he had written. He wrote about what it meant to him that she had written that, and he wrote about it with care, not overclaiming and not dismissing it. He wrote that he had been honest with her about his reasons for coming and about what he was and was not expecting, and he wanted to be honest now too. He wrote, "I think about you often. I think about the homestead and the lamp in the window, and the way you looked at me across the supper table like you were trying to determine whether I was what I appeared to be. I want you to know that I am. I don't have anything I'm hiding. I'm just a man who went in the direction that seemed right and found something there that he wasn't expecting. He ended the letter by asking whether she would consider a visit. He wrote, "I would come to Nevada, or you could come to Texas. I leave the choice entirely to you. I just think that letters are good for some things and not entirely sufficient for others." Annie read this letter on a cold March morning with the first hint of spring in the air, the sky over the Nevada flat an almost impossible blue, and she sat with it for a long time. Then she went and found Hester Beaumont, because Hester was the person you went to in Calico Flats when you needed to think out loud. Hester listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to matters she considered important, which involved a stillness and a directness of gaze that lesser people found intimidating. "You like this man," Hester said when Annie had finished. "I respect him," Annie said. "I find him interesting. I think he's honest." "Those are," Hester said, "three of the best things you can say about a person. Do you like him?" Annie was quiet. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." "Then go see him," Hester said, "or have him come here. But stop writing letters and pretending that's enough when it isn't." "I only met him once," Annie said, "for 3 days." "You've written to him for 4 months," Hester said. "That's not one meeting, that's 100 meetings. You've just been having them on paper." Annie went back to the homestead and sat at the table and wrote Timothy Watkins a letter saying she thought it was time for a visit, and suggesting that spring in Nevada, when the desert bloomed briefly and beautifully before the summer heat set in, was perhaps the better time for a second impression than the December cold he had endured on his first visit. His reply came back in 2 weeks. He would come in April. April arrived the way it always did in the Nevada desert, without apology and with a brief and gorgeous insistence on beauty. The alkali flat, which was gray-white and apparently lifeless for most of the year, produced each spring a thin flowering of desert plants, small purple asters and yellow brittlebush, and the occasional wild verbena, that lasted about 3 weeks before the heat erased them. It was, Annie had always thought, the most honest landscape she had ever seen, because it did not pretend to be lush and it did not pretend the beauty was permanent. But the beauty it offered was entirely genuine and not apologetic about its brevity. Timothy rode in on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of the first week of April. She watched him come up the track from the window, and she noticed that he rode the same way he had in December, that balanced patience, that ease, and that the roan was the same horse, and was apparently the kind of horse that remembered where it had been and moved toward the barn without being directed. She went outside before he reached the yard. He looked different in April than he had in December. The long canvas coat was gone, and he was wearing a plain linen shirt and leather vest, and a bandana around his neck that was dark red, almost the color of the brittlebush, though she doubted he had chosen it for that reason. He was brown from the spring sun and looked rested in the way a man looks when he has been sleeping well and has something to look forward to. "Hello, Annie Graves," he said and smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile, and it reorganized his face completely into something that she felt, not without alarm, directly in the center of her chest. "Hello, Timothy Watkins," she said. "You made good time." "I had motivation," he said, and swung down from the horse. He stayed a full week this time. She had arranged it as a visit rather than an accident, which meant she had thought about meals and prepared for them, and had made a point of having something in the house that was not stew, which she considered the minimum social effort appropriate to the occasion. She had baked bread and put up a jar of the chokecherry preserves she had made in October, and had traded 3 eggs to Hester Beaumont for a piece of cured ham. And when she set these things on the table on the first evening, Timothy Watkins looked at the spread and then at her and said, with complete sincerity, "This is very kind." "It is just dinner," Annie said. "I know," he said. "That's why it's kind." The second day they went out across the flat together in the morning, when the air was still cool and the desert was doing its brief annual performance of beauty. She showed him the property, the claim, which she had been maintaining out of habit and stubbornness rather than any real expectation of silver, the kitchen garden, the irrigation channel Robert had dug and she had extended. She showed him the view from the low rise to the west, where you could see 40 miles of desert and the mountains beyond going blue and pale with distance, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "It's beautiful," he said finally, "in a way that I don't think you can understand if you've only seen it in winter." "No," Annie said, "you can't." He turned to look at her, and the morning light was full and honest, and she did not look away. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Ask it. Are you happy here?" She considered the question, which was the kind of question that deserved consideration. "I am not unhappy," she said carefully. "I've made a life here, I know this land, I know how to live on it, but happy is a word that requires a certain—" She paused. "It requires a certain kind of fullness that I think I have been managing without for a while. Would you consider," he said, and then stopped, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he brought to most things. "Would you consider not a business arrangement, not a practical proposal, I mean, would you consider coming to Texas? Not to look at the land, not to assess any kind of partnership, just to see if what we've built in letters is the same thing in person." She looked at him. "And if it is, then I would ask you something more significant," he said, "but only then, and only if it was what you wanted." The wind moved across the flat and lifted the fine pale dust in slow spirals, and Annie Graves stood on the low rise above her homestead and looked at the 40 miles of distance and the blue mountains and the man standing next to her, who had ridden 3 weeks in December because he believed in the rightness of a direction. And she thought about all the ways she had learned not to trust, and about how exhausting it was to maintain that distrust with any great consistency in the face of evidence that kept contradicting it. "I would consider it," she said. He let out a breath slowly and nodded, and did not push further, and she appreciated that enormously. On the 4th evening of his visit they sat on the front steps of the house in the late evening warmth, and she read to him from Henry V the Agincourt speech, and he listened with the same completeness he brought to everything. And when she finished he said, "I think I understand now why you found it heartbreaking. It's not that the speech is a lie. It's that it works. And the fact that it works is both wonderful and terrible." "Yes," Annie said, "exactly that." He turned to look at her in the evening light, and his expression was she searched for the word. Undefended was the word she found. He was not performing calm or certainty. He was just there, looking at her, with whatever he felt visible in his face without apology. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I'm not saying it to push you toward anything or to put any obligation on you whatsoever." "Tell me," she said. "I have been happier this week than I have been in a very long time, not because of anything dramatic, just the specific way of being in the presence of someone who understands the things you say and says things you want to understand. I have not had a great deal of that." Annie was quiet for a moment. "Neither have I," she said. The word hung between them in the desert evening air, and the stars came out over the flat, brilliant and extravagant in the way that stars in the desert are extravagant when there is no town close enough to compete with them. And they sat there for a long while saying nothing, and the silence was comfortable in the specific way that silence is comfortable only with someone you have begun, without entirely deciding to trust. He left on a Saturday morning, the same organized departure as December, but different in the feeling of it. She walked to the barn with him this time rather than finding him there already, and she helped him pack the saddlebags, though there was no need for her help, and when he was ready to go he stood holding the reins and looked at her. "Come to Texas," he said. "Come in the summer, I'll write you with the route." "I'll come," she said. He put his hat on. He looked at her for a moment longer. "Annie," he said, "I just want you to know." "I know," she said. He looked surprised for just a moment, and then he smiled, and she thought she was going to be seeing that smile in her memory for quite some time. He rode out and she stood in the yard and watched him go, and this time she did not hold her breath. Instead, she breathed in the warm April air and the faint, clean smell of the brittle bush and thought, "This is what it feels like when something opens." The spring passed quickly after that. She prepared for the trip to Texas with the methodical practicality that characterized everything she did, arranging for Hester Beaumont's son, a reliable boy of 16 named Marcus, to look in on the animals every other day, setting aside enough money for the journey, writing to Clara Whitmore, Timothy's sister, to say she was coming and to ask whether she would be imposing. Clara Whitmore wrote back within 10 days in a handwriting that was energetic and warm, and said that Annie's visit was not an imposition, but was instead, if she was being direct, the answer to a great deal of concern about her brother's tendency to live too much inside his own head and not enough in the actual world, and that Clara was very much looking forward to meeting her. Timothy's route instructions arrived the following week, detailed and clear, with notes about the stage connections and the water situation at certain points along the way, the kind of practical thoroughness she had come to associate with him. He had added at the end, in different ink as though written at a different time, "I have been thinking about the desert flowers you described. I don't have brittlebush in Texas, but there are bluebonnets in the spring, and I wish you could have been here to see them. Perhaps next year." Annie read that last sentence 3 times. Perhaps next year. She left for Texas on the 15th of June, which was hot but not yet at the peak of the summer heat, and she traveled by stage through 3 Nevada towns, and then into the Utah Territory, and then by stage again through the Texas Panhandle country, until she reached Harlan County, which turned out to be a place very different from Nevada in the specific ways. Timothy had described red clay instead of alkali, live oaks instead of sage, a sky that was bigger somehow despite being the same sky. Clara Whitmore met her at the stage depot, which was a plank building at the edge of a town considerably smaller than Calico Flats, with the energy and forward motion of a person who has decided something and is acting on it. She was 35, darker than Timothy and with the same direct eyes and the same quality of saying what she meant, and she took Annie's bag and said, "He has been unbearable for 3 weeks. He cleaned the house twice. He mended a fence that did not need mending." "He cleaned the house twice," Annie said, and found herself smiling. "He would be mortified if he knew I told you," Clara said with visible satisfaction. Timothy was at the house when they arrived. His land was 2 miles outside the town, and Clara had driven out to meet the stage. He came out of the house when the wagon pulled up, and he looked at Annie with an expression that she thought she would spend some time thinking about, the particular expression of a person who has waited a long time for something and is now required to reckon with its reality. He looked, in short, exactly the way she suspected she looked. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she told him. He helped her down from the wagon, and his hand around hers was warm and certain, and he held on for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary to assist someone out of a wagon, and she let him. She stayed 2 weeks. The house was exactly as he had described it, solid and spare, built by a man who had been planning for function and not comfort, with large windows that let in the light, and a kitchen that was practical and minimal, and a parlor with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf with a dozen books that she went to immediately and ran her fingers along like greeting old friends. He had a Bible and a copy of Plutarch's Lives and a complete set of Scott's Waverley novels and a trail guide to the Southwest Territories, and at the end of the shelf, a battered copy of Henry V, separate from the complete works, clearly purchased alone. She turned to look at him. He was watching her from the doorway. "I found it in a shop in San Antonio," he said, "in March. I don't know why I'm telling you that, as though the timing is relevant." "The timing," Annie said carefully, "is entirely relevant. She got to know his land the way you get to know a person, gradually and specifically. She learned the creek that ran through the eastern portion, mostly dry now in June, but with enough water in the pools to sustain the cattle. She learned the particular quality of the Texas heat, which was different from the Nevada heat in being wetter, less absolute, more like an argument than a fact. She learned the live oak trees, which she found she liked enormously, ancient and solid and green when everything else was brown. She met Esteban Reyes, who came over on the third day and looked at Annie with the assessing calm of a person who has seen many things come and go and has developed good judgment about which things are worth paying attention to. He spoke to her in a mix of English and Spanish, the Spanish being the more expressive language when he was making a point, and she understood more of it than she had expected. After Esteban left, Timothy said, "He likes you." "How can you tell?" "He stayed for 2 hours. He usually leaves after 20 minutes. Clara came out frequently, which Annie enjoyed, and the three of them spent several evenings together on Timothy's porch in the cooling Texas dark talking about things that ranged widely: the state of the cattle market, the political situation in the territory, the books on his shelf, the nature of luck, and whether it was a real thing or simply the name you gave to the intersection of preparation and opportunity. It was on one of these evenings that Clara said, with the particular unsubtle subtlety of a woman who has decided to move things along, that she needed to get home and left Annie and Timothy alone on the porch in the blue evening with the fireflies beginning in the grass below the step. "Your sister," Annie said. "She is not even slightly subtle," Timothy agreed. "No," Annie said, "but she's not wrong." He turned to look at her, and in the evening light his face was open and still and honest, the same way it had been on the Nevada flat in April. "Annie," he said, "I would like to tell you something." "Tell me." "I know that you went through a marriage that did not give you what it should have. I know that you have learned to be very careful and very self-sufficient, and that both of those things have served you well. I'm not asking you to stop being those things." He paused. "But I have spent these 2 weeks with you, and I have spent the last 6 months writing to you and reading your letters and thinking about your letters, and I want you to know that I am entirely in love with you." The fireflies rose and fell in the grass below them. "That is," Annie said after a moment, "the most direct thing you have ever said to me." "I know," he said. "I have been working up to it." "How long?" "Approximately since March," he said. "When you wrote about not trusting instincts but beginning to think some people's instincts were better calibrated than others." He paused. "I knew then. I have been trying to be patient." Annie looked at the fireflies for a moment, then she looked at him. "I am frightened," she said. "I want you to know that, not of you, of being wrong again, of trusting and finding that the trust was misplaced. I have been alone for 9 months, and I have made a kind of peace with it, and some part of me is afraid to give that peace up for something that might not hold." "I know," he said. "But I am also," she continued, and her voice was steady, "in love with you. I have been for some time. I have been calling it something else: respect, interest, liking, because those words felt safer. But it is love. I know what it is." He took her hand. He took it with both of his and held it without speaking for a moment, and the simple fact of that, the warmth and the steadiness of it, undid something in her chest that had been held tight since September of last year, since the mound of earth and the words she had said alone in the wind, since she had sat at the table in the dark while the candle burned down. "I am not going to be Robert," he said. "I can't promise you everything will always go right. No one can promise that. But I can promise you that I will be honest with you, and that I will not be absent from my own life or yours. I will be here." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it's frightening, because I believe you." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, a formal and gentle gesture that was somehow more moving than something more dramatic would have been. "Marry me," he said. "Not for practical reasons, not for the land or the cattle or any arrangement of benefit to either party. Because I am in love with you, and I believe we will be good for each other in ways that will matter for a long time." Annie looked at the fireflies and the dark grass and the Texas sky and the man sitting beside her holding her hand. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He smiled, and the relief and the joy in it were entirely unguarded, entirely honest, entirely him, and she thought that she was going to spend a great many years looking at that smile and never find it ordinary. They were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after Annie had packed down the earth over Robert Graves's grave and decided she was finished. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher in the small church in Harlan County on a Saturday morning when the Texas sky was the deep blue of autumn and the live oaks were beginning to think about turning. Clara Whitmore stood up with Annie, and Esteban Reyes stood up with Timothy. And afterward there was a supper at Clara's house with the people of Harlan County, who had followed the whole business of Timothy and the widow woman from Nevada, with the invested attention that small communities bring to the romantic lives of their members. Annie wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico that Hester Beaumont had sent from Nevada as a wedding gift, along with a note that said, "I told you so," which Annie found entirely fair. Timothy wore his good coat and a string tie and looked at Annie walking toward him in the small church with the full-facing openness of a man who has nothing to hide and nothing to perform, who is simply and entirely present in the most important moment he has yet experienced. And Annie, walking toward him, thought, "Here is a man who is exactly what he appears to be. Here is a man who went in the direction that seemed right and trusted the going. Here is a man I trust." She had given up on being found. She had decided with what had felt like finality that the finding was someone else's story, that her story was about managing and enduring and making the best of what remained. She had written the letter saying no. She had been certain, and here he was. They sold the Nevada homestead in October. A couple from California bought it. A young man with hopeful eyes and a wife who looked at the desert with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to be brave. And Annie brought the tin can with the $47 and the 3 books and the chokecherry preserves, and the memory of Brittlebush, and the knowledge of how to live on a hard piece of land. And she came to Texas. The house that Timothy had built for function became, over the following months, something else. Not because anything dramatic was done to it. There was no sudden transformation, no single renovation that changed its character, but because a house that is lived in by 2 people who pay attention to each other, and to the space they share gradually fills itself up with evidence of lives being built. The bookshelf grew. Shakespeare and Plutarch and Scott and the trail guide were joined by the Bible from Nevada and the water-stained English novel, and a new volume of American poetry that Annie found at a shop in San Antonio, and a natural history of the Southwest that Timothy ordered through the mail, and which arrived in January looking very official, and which they both read with great interest. There was a rug in the parlor, a deep red and blue woven rug that had belonged to Esteban Reyes's mother, which Esteban presented to them at Christmas with the air of a man bestowing something significant and expecting the significance to be recognized. There were curtains in the bedroom window, blue ones, which Annie made. There was a kitchen garden, started in early spring in the Texas clay, in which the plants that grew well in Nevada did not all grow well in Texas, and the plants that grew well in Texas were new to Annie and required learning, which she engaged with seriously, and with the kind of focused competence that Timothy had come to understand was her particular mode of encountering challenges. He watched her in the garden, sometimes from the kitchen window or the porch. He watched her with the particular attention of a person who is still, months in, slightly amazed by the fact of what they have. He told her this once, that he still surprised himself sometimes, still turned in the yard or woke in the morning, and found the fact of her presence a specific and sustained amazement. And she had looked at him with something warm and slightly undone, and said that she understood entirely. In the spring of 1880, on a warm April morning when the bluebonnets were doing exactly what Timothy had described in the letter she had read in Nevada, Annie told him she was expecting. He was at the fence on the south side of the property, doing the never-ending maintenance that fences required in cattle country, and she walked out to him because she did not want to wait until he came in, and she told him directly, the way she told him most things, because she had found that directness was both her nature and, between them, the right approach. He dropped the fence wire and looked at her, and then he stepped over the wire and took her face in both his hands and held it with the same careful certainty he brought to everything, and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. "You are all right," he said. "You are well." "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well." He let out a breath and then he smiled with his whole face, and she had been right all along about the smile. It had not become ordinary. She did not think it ever would. "A child," he said, with the tonal quality of a man who is trying the word out and finding it larger than he expected. "A child," she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms and held her there in the bluebonnet field with the Texas sky very blue above them, and the cattle moving slowly in the distance, and Esteban Reyes's smoke rising from the chimney 2 miles east. And he did not say anything for a long time, and she felt his heartbeat against her, and thought that this was one of those moments that you would carry for a long time, not a dramatic moment, not the kind of moment that would make a good story to tell, but the kind of moment that is the actual architecture of a life, the moment that everything else is built on. He said, quietly, into her hair, "I am so glad I went in the right direction." She laughed, which surprised her, a genuine and uncalculated laugh. "You are incredibly stubborn," she said. "Clara told you that. Clara told me everything." The child was born in November of 1880, a boy, arriving in the way of most births of that era and place with the attendance of the midwife from Harlan County, a capable woman named Dorothea, and Clara, who proved to be exactly the right person to have in a room where practical competence and calm were required. Timothy spent the hours of the labor outside the bedroom door in the specific particular anguish of a man who can do nothing to help, but cannot bring himself to go further away. Esteban sat with him for part of it, saying very little but being present in the way the old man had of making presence itself a form of comfort. When Dorothea came to the door and told him he could come in, Timothy Watkins walked into that room and looked at his wife, who was exhausted and luminous, and at the small red-faced person she was holding, and the look on his face, Annie saw it clearly from the bed, was something that had no appropriate name in any language she knew, a particular compound of wonder and gratitude and an absolutely helpless love that she recognized because she felt it herself. "A boy," he said. "A boy," Dorothea confirmed from the corner. He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at his son, and then he looked at Annie, and he said quietly, "What should we call him?" They had discussed this beforehand, more thoroughly than Timothy had expected would be necessary, because Annie had opinions about names and the weight of them. They had agreed on 2 possibilities, and now that the person in question existed, it seemed right to look at him and see which name fit. Annie looked at the small face, scrunched and earnest, already showing the determined jaw that she recognized from somewhere familiar. "James," she said. "James Esteban Watkins." Timothy looked at her. "Esteban." "Esteban has been on this land for 30 years and has been good to us," Annie said. "I think that deserves acknowledgement." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think that is exactly right," in the tone of a man who is consistently impressed by the person he married and has stopped being surprised by it, though he has not stopped appreciating it. They told Esteban that evening, Clara carrying the baby across the 2 miles with Timothy and Annie following more slowly, Annie still moving carefully from the day's exertions. Esteban opened the door of his house and looked at them and at the infant in Clara's arms and then at Timothy. "You called him Esteban," he said. "James Esteban Watkins," Timothy said. The old man looked at the baby for a long moment with an expression that he clearly did not intend to be visible on his face, but was unable entirely to prevent. He took the baby from Clara with the practiced ease of a man who had held many babies in his life, and he spoke to him quietly in Spanish, and Annie caught enough of it to understand that he was telling the baby something about the land, about what it meant and what it remembered, about the responsibility of being a person who lived on it. When Esteban handed James back, he looked at Annie and said, in his careful English, "You are a good woman. I told him that 6 months before you arrived." You told him I was a good woman before you met me. I told him, Esteban said, with the precision of a man who knows the difference between the words he used and the words being attributed to him, that he should go find himself a good woman because a good man alone was only half a thing. Whether you were good I had to determine for myself. And, Annie said, you asked the right questions, he said simply. That is enough for me. The years that followed were the years that constitute a life, ordinary in the way that happiness is ordinary, not eventless, not without difficulty, but sustained and real and built on something solid. Timothy's cattle operation grew. He had 20 head by 1882 and 30 by 1884, and he brought in a hand named Russell who was steady and good with animals, and the small operation became something that looked, unmistakably, like a ranch. Annie kept the kitchen garden and expanded it considerably, trading vegetables with Clara and Esteban and the other families of Harlan County in the long tradition of community barter that sustained small western communities through the dry years. She also, to Timothy's initial surprise, and then to his complete unsurprise once he thought about it, proved to have strong and useful opinions about the cattle operation itself, about breeding decisions and grazing rotation, and the particular qualities of the creek that fed the east pasture. She had paid attention in Nevada to the land and the way Robert had managed the claim and water rights, and she had learned more than she had known she was learning, and in Texas she applied it. She also wrote letters, because she had discovered that she was a person who thought well through letters, and she kept up a correspondence with Hester Beaumont in Calico Flats that lasted for years, Hester's letters arriving with their dry wit and their Calico Flats gossip, and the occasional note about the Nevada homestead, which she reported was being worked by the California couple with more optimism than results. She wrote to Clara even after Clara married a rancher from the next county over in 1882 and moved 20 miles away, because distance was no reason to stop talking. James Esteban Watkins grew. He grew in the way that children grow on land with something rooted in him, a groundedness that Timothy recognized and Annie cultivated. He was her husband's jaw in her own eyes, which was the exact distribution she would have chosen if she had been given options. He was curious about everything, including the books on the shelf, which he could not read but insisted on carrying from a young age, claiming them by weight and importance. By the time he was 3, he had a definite view about the superiority of Esteban Reyes's company to most other available company, a view that Esteban found appropriate, and that Annie found extremely telling about both of them. In 1883, Annie told Timothy she was expecting again. He was at the kitchen table this time, reading the natural history of the Southwest, and she was standing at the stove, and she told him over her shoulder in the comfortable tone of two people who have been talking to each other for years, because that was where they had arrived by then, a place where significant things could be said in comfortable tones, which was its own form of intimacy. He set the book down and looked at the back of her head. "You're certain?" "I am," she said. He got up from the table and came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and bent and pressed his mouth to the side of her neck. "I love you," he said into her neck. "I know," she said. "I love you too." The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1884, on a morning when the Bluebonnets were doing their annual brilliant performance in the field below the house. They named her Clara Ruth Watkins, for Clara and for Annie's mother, who had died in Ohio years ago, and who Annie still thought about in the spring when flowers appeared suddenly where there had been no flowers. Timothy held his daughter with the same stunned tenderness he had brought to holding James 3 years before, though this time he was better at concealing the overwhelmed quality of it, having had practice. He looked at Annie over the baby's head and said, "Two," she agreed. "That is," he said, "something." "It is," she said. "Are you?" "I am very well," she said, preempting him. "I am, in fact, quite wonderful," he smiled. Esteban Reyes died in the autumn of 1885 quietly in his sleep, which was the right kind of death for a man who had lived the right kind of life. Timothy was with him at the end, and the loss was a genuine and specific grief, the kind you feel when someone who was not your family by blood was your family by everything that actually constitutes family. They buried him on his own land, which had been his wish, and Timothy marked the grave with a stone that Esteban had apparently already selected and set aside, which said something about the old man that made Annie both sad and fond. James, who was 4, stood at the graveside with the seriousness of a small person who understands that something important is happening even if he does not fully understand what. He held Timothy's hand on one side and Annie's on the other, and afterward he said, with the directness of small children, he was the best old man. He was, Timothy said. He told me things, James said. What did he tell you? About the land, James said. He said the land remembers. He told me that. Timothy looked at Annie over their son's head, and she could see in his face the particular compound of grief and love that this moment was made of, the way a good life and a loss are inseparable, the way the people who shape us carry on in the people who carry their names and their words. The land remembers, Timothy repeated softly to James. That is true. You should keep remembering that. By 1886, the ranch had taken on the character of something established. The house had been added to a proper bedroom for the children, a larger kitchen, a porch that wrapped around the east side where you could sit in the evenings and watch the light go off the creek and listen to the cattle and the night sounds of the Texas plain. The bookshelves needed another shelf. The kitchen garden was one of the most productive in the county, which Annie considered a reasonable point of pride. Russell had become a permanent fixture. Sleeping in the small bunkhouse Timothy had built and treating the ranch with the proprietary care of someone who has decided it is his too, which it was, in the ways that matter. Timothy had a habit in these years that Annie noticed and kept quiet about, because some things are more beautiful for not being remarked on. He would come inside at the end of the day, at the end of working, at the end of whatever the day had been, and before he did anything else he would find her. Not dramatically. It was not a theatrical thing. He would simply come in and find the room she was in and stand there for a moment, just long enough to see her, before going to wash up or to check on the children or to do whatever came next. It was the habit of a man who had decided, once and for a long time ago, that the most important thing to know at the end of a day was that certain things were where they were supposed to be. She had her own version of it. She kept track of where he was in a way that she could not fully justify practically. She knew when he was in the south pasture versus the creek field versus the barn. She knew by the sound of his horse which direction he was coming from. She knew his footsteps on the porch from the footsteps of anyone else. She had become fluent in the particular language of him, which was something she had not known was a capacity she had until she discovered it was. One evening in the autumn of 1886, after the children were in bed and they were sitting on the east porch in the cooling air, Timothy said, "Do you ever miss Nevada?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I miss Hester," she said. "I miss the desert flowers. I miss the particular quality of that sky which is different from this sky." She paused. "But I don't miss the life I was living there. I miss the landscape and the good parts of what I learned there, but I don't miss being alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he said. "Are you ever sorry you came?" she asked. "That you were that stubborn? You rode 3 weeks in December on the basis of a feeling." "No," he said. "I am never sorry about that. Not even when I sent the letter saying no. Especially not then," he said. "The letter made it clear that you were a person who said what you meant and who had reasons for what you decided. I respect that. It just also seemed to me that the reasons were based on information that might be incomplete, and I wanted to offer some additional information in person." "That is," Annie said, "the most diplomatic description of ignoring a clear rejection that I have ever heard." "I didn't ignore it," he said. "I honored it. I came without any expectation that it would change. I genuinely would have turned around and gone home if that's what you'd wanted." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't want you to. He took her hand, which was warm from the coffee cup she had been holding. "I told you," he said, "that I had not given up on the finding, and here I was. Here you were," she said, "fixing my south wall. The south wall needed fixing." "Everything about this," Annie said, "has been very practical on the surface. And underneath." She looked at the creek and the darkening field and the first stars coming out over Texas, and she thought about the letter she had written saying no, and the steps she had not known she was taking toward here, and the particular stubbornness of the man sitting next to her holding her hand, and the way a person can be so certain they are finished and turn out to be entirely wrong in the best possible way. "Underneath," she said, "it has been entirely wonderful." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it the same way he had on the porch in Texas 2 years before she had become his wife, that careful, gentle gesture, and she thought, "This is what I did not expect." Not the events of it, not the logistics of being found when she had stopped looking, but the specific quality of being known. Being known by someone who had sought out the knowing, who had ridden a long way in the cold to begin the work of it, who had written letters for months to continue the work of it, who showed up every day and kept showing up. She had told him she had given up on being found. He had said he had not given up on finding. And here he was, and here she was. And the stars came out over Texas, and James Esteban slept in his room dreaming, whatever 4-year-old children dream, and Clara Ruth was still small enough to sleep with her fists closed like promises. And the land remembered everything that had happened on it, and would keep remembering, and the night was warm and long and entirely, simply, whole. The years did not stop at the beautiful moments but moved through them the way all good years do, carrying the beauty along into the continuing. James grew into a boy of 6 and 7, and 8 who could ride a horse before most children in Harlan County, who had Esteban's old land sense and Timothy's patience and Annie's eyes, and her particular way of looking at things directly. He helped with the cattle from the time he could be useful and asked questions relentlessly about everything from the behavior of water, to the names of stars, to the reasons why things were the way they were. And Timothy answered what he could, and told him honestly when he did not know, which James seemed to find as useful as the answers. Clara Ruth was softer in temperament than her brother and harder in will, which Annie recognized as a combination she had some personal experience with. She was determined about small things with a thoroughness that was slightly alarming and endlessly funny. She was the first of the 2 children to identify that books contained something worth having, and she brought them to Annie from the shelf and sat in her lap, and demanded to know what they said from an age that seemed too early for the demand to make sense. But Annie read to her, and the words went in, and Clara Ruth grew up with stories inside her that she would have all her life. In 1888, on a warm June morning when James was 7, and Clara Ruth was 4, and the ranch was something Timothy could look at from any edge of it, and feel the solid, particular satisfaction of something built well over time. Annie came to find him at the far south fence line, where he was working, and she walked out across the grass in the summer heat, and he saw her coming, and set down the wire stretcher and waited. She came up and stood in front of him in the bright morning and said, "There will be a third." He looked at her. He looked at her in the specific way he had looked at her in April of 1879 in the Nevada desert, in September of 1879 in the small church, in November of 1880 in the bedroom with James newly in the world, in April of 1884 with Clara Ruth, and now here in the June heat with the cattle moving in the background and the live oaks dark and still. "A third," he said. "A third," she said. He shook his head slowly, not in negation but in that familiar amazement that had never fully resolved into simple acceptance. "This life," he said. "This life," she agreed. He opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her there in the summer morning with everything around them that they had built together. The land and the animals and the children inside the house and the years of letters, and the December ride and the south wall and the bluebonnets, and the words said over graves and the words said in churches, and the words said on porches in the dark, and the words written on paper, and the words not said at all but known, fully and without reservation. between two people who had been looking in the same direction for long enough to stop being surprised when they saw the same thing. The third child was born in January of 1889, another boy, and they named him Thomas Henry Watkins. Thomas for nobody in particular, and Henry because Annie felt the old king deserved at least something. Some acknowledgement of all those evenings when his words had been the company she kept. Thomas was born into a household that was already loud and full and particular, with an older brother who greeted him with grave assessment, and a sister who decided immediately that he was going to require her management. And he grew into both of these from the start, fitting into the family the way a last piece fits a puzzle, not because the picture was incomplete without it, but because with it something about the shape of things is right. Russell stayed on and became as much a part of the family as anyone. Clara, Timothy's sister, visited every few weeks with her husband George and their own 2 children, and the Harlan County days became full of the specific noise and complexity of extended families doing life close together, which was both chaotic and entirely sustaining. Hester Beaumont wrote from Calico Flats in the spring of 1889 that she had sold the dry goods store to a nephew and was coming to Texas to see what all this was about. And she arrived in May in a manner that was exactly her efficient, slightly alarmed by the heat, assessing everything and everyone with the pencil stub squint that had been fixed at some early point in her life. And she stayed 3 weeks and went back with the air of a person whose worries have been resolved. "Well," she wrote to Annie afterward, "you did well, Annie Graves, you did very well." Annie sat at the table in the kitchen with the letter, and Timothy was at the stove making coffee, and the children were outside in the yard making the particular kind of noise that children make when they are healthy and unsupervised, and she read the letter and smiled. "Hester approves," she said. Timothy turned from the stove with the coffee pot and looked at her. "I'm glad," he said with entire sincerity. "I was hoping she would." "Were you worried?" "A little," he said. "She is," he said carefully, "a formidable woman." "She is," Annie agreed. "She told me to come find you, not in those words, but in those words." He poured the coffee and sat across from her at the table that had been his before she came, which had been a spare bachelor's table, and was now a family table with the specific marks and qualities of a table that is used constantly and well. "Then I owe her a debt," he said. "We both do," Annie said. She folded the letter and set it on the table and looked at the man across from her. The man who had been a name in a letter in a Nevada winter, who had ridden 3 weeks in December because something told him this was the right direction, who had stood in her yard in the dark and stated his name and purpose with the plain directness that was entirely him. And she thought about all the ways a life is made up of the things you almost didn't do, the letters almost not written, the doors almost not opened, the no that almost stayed a no. "I am very glad," she said, "that you didn't take that letter as the final word." "I took it seriously," he said. "But I had been thinking about you for too long by then to think that one letter was the whole story. That is still," she said, "the most impractical basis for a 3-week winter ride I have ever heard." "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed, and reached across the table and took his hand, and the sound of the children came in through the open window with the summer air, and the light moved across the floor the way light moves when the day is long and good and full. And outside the live oaks stood in their old patient certainty, and the creek ran in its channel, and the cattle moved slowly in the south pasture, and the land remembered everything, all of it, every right decision and every act of stubborn hope, and held it. The afternoon was warm and ordinary and entirely theirs. She had told him she had given up on being found. He had said he had not given up on finding. Here, at last, was everything.